Morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning on this rather bleak Thursday morning. Hopefully the weather where you are isn't too bad. I know we've got people from pretty much all over the country. So, yeah, pretty miserable here at the moment, but fingers crossed that we all stay good from a technology perspective and what have you. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Craig Pritchard. I am a corporate pension specialist at Integrity 365. My role is helping companies kind of set up, run, govern pension schemes, but I'm absolutely delighted that you're able to join us this morning. This is our first kind of employer level webinar that we've run in conjunction with Partners and, who are kind of an eco partner, strategic partner of Integrity 365. And we're absolutely delighted that you're joining us today. I know everyone's very busy, but hopefully you're going to find this session very beneficial when we're talking around kind of HR hot topics into 2024. So in terms of who we have with us today, I'm absolutely delighted that we've got a couple of great presenters and myself at the end. So we've got Steve Herbert, who's joining us. He is the Wellbeing and Benefits Director at Partners and. I would call him I don't want to big him up too much, but benefits guru.
Go on.
Yeah, go on. Yeah, I was going to, an industry heavyweight. Take that in the right way, Steve, in the context is meant. But yeah,
in
really,
every context, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
But highly respected in the industry, kind of a regular kind of commentator within the industry and a kind of go-to person for all things employee benefits. So I know he's got a really good kind of fun, kind of informative session coming up. And then we have Sophie. Sophie is a colleague of mine at Integrity 365, an IFA who highly experienced, highly skilled at what she does, tends to deal with really complex financial areas, which goes over my head when she talks about them in meetings, and generally deals with kind of high net worth individuals. And thrilled that she's taken the time out today to join us to talk about kind of all the fun things such as inflation and markets and things that all obviously have an impact on you and your employees. And then finally at the end, Craig Pritchard, I'm going to cover off some of the factors around kind of workplace pensions and some of the kind of themes that we're seeing in the workplace, which will impact your staff. Okay, so we're going to allow kind of 45 minutes for the session. There's going to be time for Q&A at the end. If you've got any questions, please feel free to put them on the Q&A button or the chat, and the three of us will deal with them at the end. Okay, so it looks a pretty busy agenda. So probably, Steve was going to cover off the kind of first three areas there, a bit of a look at the economy, challenging times, a little bit how we can deal with well-being and looking into next year. Sophie's got the tough job of talking around kind of world events and inflation and how that impacts us all. And then, as I say, I'll talk a little bit around kind of workplace pension schemes. So I think kind of without further ado, we'll get the session properly started and I'll hand you over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you. And if we get this right, guys, there should be a sort of golden thread through the middle of this, all to do with the economy, because it ties into what I'm talking about, what you'll be doing as employers, what Sophie is going to talk about, and indeed, it obviously plays into pensions as well. So hopefully this will all join together somewhere down the line. I have turned my camera off because I don't like looking at me, so I don't suppose you do either. But hopefully this will all work as we go through it. So what's in store for 2024, which is scans rather nicely, if nothing else. And I think we have to start, and something we will come back to probably in all three presentations to a lesser or greater degree with the economic outlook. Because before we can look forward, we probably need to look back, because you don't need me to tell you that so far the 2020s have been, let's be honest, bloody awful. I mean, it's just a reality of where we are today, guys. I wish I could say otherwise, but I can't. We started off with the back end of the 6-year political business investment hiatus that was Brexit. It doesn't really matter whether you were for or against Brexit now. It's all happened. It's in the past. But I have to say businesses are still struggling with it. And most people, particularly in business, aren't that happy with the outcome as it currently stands. That may change, but it's not done us many favours as a country so far. Just as Brexit was coming to its conclusion, obviously hoving into view was that horrible experience on a humanitarian and a business level of COVID-19, which we don't want to go too much back into, but we know that was a horrible couple of years. And as that came to the, if not the end, at least the worst excesses came to an end, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Humanitarian costs is obvious. The financial costs for Ukraine and Russia was obvious, perhaps less so the fact that they then rolled on to Europe and particularly the UK, because we were very, very exposed and are very, very exposed to that whole gas issue, which caused us some major problems, not least around inflation. And then the last few weeks, we have what's arguably an even worse humanitarian issue, the one between Israel and Hamas, or vice versa, which we don't know what the economic impact of that is. We do know there will be an economic impact. And if history tells us anything, it's when things kick off in the Middle East, the impact because of the oil situation in the Middle East is felt around the world. And you only have to look back to 1974 to see the oil crisis in the UK to realize how bad that could potentially be. So we've had all of those things, all major seismic events, concertinaed into just 4 years at the start of this decade. And it's been, from a business and from an economic point of view, like a whirlwind, a tornado ripping through the UK economy, moving backwards, forwards, left and right. We're never quite sure where it's going to go next. But wherever it touches down, wherever it makes landfall, if you like, it is causing chaos. And we are still in the midst of that tornado, even now, unfortunately. But where are we as an economy right now? Because that's probably where we need to start. And strangely, despite all that turbulence, despite all those issues, the economy itself is in something of a dead calm. Not a good place, not a bad place, just not really much of a place at all. And if you doubt me, you only need to look at this chart, which is a couple of months out of date. It doesn't really matter, guys, which shows you the gross domestic product of the UK. Now, if you don't know what gross domestic product, GDP, is, in very simple terms, it's whether the economy is getting bigger or smaller. It's the value of everything we do. So everything I do, you do, all your employees do, everyone in the UK does, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year. Now, this chart is on a monthly basis showing you GDP in the UK. In very simple terms, if we're above that red line, the economy is getting bigger. We as a nation are getting richer. If we're below that line, the opposite is true. They call it negative growth, which means nothing at all. The economy is getting smaller below that line. Now, the good news is, over the last year or so, we've had some very good months of GDP, the economy getting bigger. Unfortunately, every time we've had a good month, it's been followed by a bad month. So the reality is, on this particular chart, the growth over the year was 0.1%, as near flatlining as it's possible to get without actually being at the flat line. And what's really quite worrying, and it's something we'll come back to throughout this presentation for sure, is that actually the changes up or down aren't driven by fiscal policy, by monetary policy, by big economic movements. They're being driven by whether we've had an extra day's bank holiday for the Queen's funeral or for a coronation. They're being driven by whether the weather is good or bad and whether that's at the right time of year. So at the moment, we are really where we shouldn't be. We're being driven by very minor ancillary facts rather than the big nation pushing forward and being more productive. Why is that? Well, it's because we've got so many headwinds to growth. And they're all coming up on the screen. We'll touch on some of these through the three presentations to a lesser or greater degree. But there is an awful lot of headwind out there. There is an awful lot of uncertainty. All of these things are really in play in a way that you don't normally see at the same time. And that bottom one, which may or may not come out later on, we have political uncertainty next year on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's ignoring all the other world politics issues. You know, we have Donald Trump, who could conceivably, unbelievably, become president from a prison cell. That is entirely possible as things currently stand. And we have the political uncertainty of what will happen in the UK. Will it be a clear majority to one party or the other, or a hung parliament, again, a coalition, whatever. So lots and lots of headwinds. The two we're going to focus on here, and the two that I'm sure that Sophie will pick up as well, are interest rates and inflation, because as far as your employees go, that's been the headline news of the last 18 months, 2 years. And they're heading in different directions, as was always expected. So inflation did peak at 11.1%. It's currently 6.7%. Food inflation is still in double figures. So inflation has come down a long way. That's great. That does not, however, mean that prices are going down. Inflation is prices going up. And if it's at 6.7%, then that means the prices that have already gone up over the last 18 months, 2 years, that are baked in, and they're going up further over the year to come. So yes, it's better that inflation is lower rather than higher, but it's still more than 3 times the Bank of England target rate of 2%. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of families, a lot of the employees that you're looking after. One of the reasons it's coming down, not the main reason, to be fair, the main reason is that dropping out of energy price spikes that went on last year after the Ukraine war started. But one of the reasons is because the Bank of England have been desperately trying to increase interest rates to bring inflation down. Now, I could tell you why that is, but we haven't got time for that today, but I'm happy to have that conversation at the end if you like. But interest rates have been going up in direct response to the inflation crisis, and we've had no less than 14 increases in interest rates over the course of the last 22 months. Now, that is a massive run of increases. We were at a 300-year, and I'll say that again, a 300-year historic low in interest rates 22 months ago at 0.1%. We're now at 5.25%, and there is a further decision expected today at lunchtime. I don't think they'll increase it, but I might be wrong. But either way, we've had a massive surge in interest rates in a very short period of time. And it's that period of time that's caused the major problem. Who does this most affect within your employees? Well, on the left, inflation most hits those people with a limited amount of discretionary spending power. So people typically on lower salaries, not universally, but typically on lower salaries, they haven't got any headroom. And if prices are still going up, which they are still being clobbered by this reality. So those people on lower salaries tend to get hit harder by inflation, not least because their money goes on things that they can't avoid spending on. They have to spend on the electric, they have to spend on the gas, they have to buy food. They don't have much money left after all of that. On the right-hand side, we have interest rates. That clobbers people with debt. So those with lots of money on credit cards, they're being hit. But the ones that are being hit the worst are those young professionals, and I'm getting on a bit now, so young is a movable feast, but typically people up to about the age of 45 with a big mortgage. So they've taken years to get onto the housing ladder because it's been very difficult and very challenging. They've got a huge amount of debt having got onto the ladder, and they've now been hit with 14 successive rate increases in a very short period of time. And of course, there'll be some of you on the call today and some of your employees who have a foot in both columns. You haven't got much discretionary spending power and you're being clobbered on a mortgage as well. So times are still tough for employees. And we'll come back to that point around pay rises shortly. What's the economic outlook? Well, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, the NIESR, produce a nice, concise projection from time to time, and they'll probably do one tomorrow following the Bank of England announcement today. This is the one from August. Their projection is that inflation will continue to fall, which it should do, all things being equal, to around 5% at the end of this year and about 4% at the end of next year. So we're still looking at twice the usual rate of inflation at the back end of 2024, 14 months' time. They expect the base rate, or they did expect the base rate to peak at 5.5%. I think most analysts are now looking at, we're at the peak already of 5.25%, but we may be wrong on that. They're expecting the UK economy to grow 0.4% this year. Put that into context. That's 0.1% for every 3 months. That is desperately bad. And they're expecting it to be even worse next year at 0.3%. And an interesting one that we will come back to a bit later on is unemployment returning to a more natural rate. Now, we all know about the candidate crisis that the UK has been going through for some years, actually. Sort of really kicked off after the Brexit referendum when a lot of European nationals returned to their homes, and it's just stayed there. Well, they're expecting unemployment to return to a more natural rate of 5%, which will still be low by historical standards. Not this year, not next year, not even the year after, but by 2026. So that is moving. We've had, I think, 14 or 15 successive increases in the rate of unemployment in the UK, but we still have a candidate crisis even now. But I think the finding that I really want to bring home to you as employers is that one there. Real wages, so that's wages above inflation, if you like, in many UK regions will be below the pre-pandemic level at the end of next year. Or to put that in very simple language, guys, we've lost half a decade, where people have actually had their income go down year on year on year. And that is putting real pressure on your employees. Which takes me rather neatly to well-being, because part of the employee well-being triangle that I talk about so often is the financial well-being of employees. But as employers, we need to recognize that there are 3 sides to that triangle. There is financial well-being, there is also physical well-being and mental well-being. And historically, we've tended to look as employers after the physical well-being of people rather than the mental and financial. And we can't keep doing that. If we want to look after the well-being of our employees, if we want them to stay engaged, productive, at work, all of those things, we need to look after all three sides of that triangle, because it can bleed across. A problem in one side can easily lead to a problem on the other two. And that point was really brought home by a survey that I was asked to comment on for the CIPD's People Management magazine back in September. And it was about employees, and it had several thousand people in the survey, so it was a meaningful survey, about employees that are financially stressed at present. And it found some immediate crossovers, if you like, to physical and mental well-being. So this particular survey found that those with financial stress were 14% more likely to be smoking or vaping more, and 19% more likely to be drinking more alcohol. Now, you could say, well, that's mad. They haven't got enough money anyway. How are they affording to buy more alcohol and smoke more? Well, the truth is that is just a natural human reaction. We tend to default through to the things that support our stress, if you like, and that's what tends to happen. So straight away, we can see that's making their financial position worse, and it's probably making their physical condition worse as well, because smoking and drinking are two of the most destructive things we can do as individuals. But not only that, we also found that those same people, more than 1 in 4 of them, are experiencing brain fog as a result of this extra financial stress. And that's leading to mistakes, both at home and, for the audience today, at work. And that just shows you how a problem in one side of the triangle can lead to problems across the board. The other challenge we've got, of course, is if it is leading to physical problems, if it is leading to mental health problems, how can you expect your employees to be supported when the NHS is at the moment, and it pains me to say this because I think the NHS is brilliant, but it is fundamentally broken as we stand here in 2023. Now, this is a chart put out by the British Medical Association, the BMA, and it charts the waiting list in England, just in England. We'll come back to other areas shortly. In England, from the financial crisis of 2007 through to 2023. And at the low point, the waiting list was still fairly chunky in England at 2.32 million people awaiting treatment. And then we hit the decade of austerity. And of course, if you're putting less money into the health service and less people into the health service, the waiting list is going to go up. And over time, it gradually went up from 2.3 million people to well over 4 million, at which point the pandemic started. And there literally was not a pause between the two. Austerity was finally concluded in Rishi Sunak's first budget speech of 2020, March 2020, which was exactly the same day that the first support for employers in the pandemic was announced. So we went seamlessly from the austerity years into the pandemic years. Of course, there was that dip just there when no one could get any treatment or diagnosis at all. So the waiting list went down for a while, and then it really took off. And just as the worst of the pandemic came to a close, we got hit with everything else in terms of the NHS. So we had the accident emergency, the ambulance crisis last year that many of you will remember, if not got caught up in. We still got the social care problem that people can't come out of the system because there is no social care available. Many of you will recall that this time last year, we were just exiting the health and social care levy that started in April last year and I think finished in November last year. And that was meant to be to bring in social care. Well, that's gone. So we're no closer to that than we were at the start of 2022. We now have 2 seasonal illness threats to the NHS. We've always had flu kicking around, and now we've got COVID as well. There's a lot less COVID jabs going in this year, so it'll be interesting to see where that takes the NHS come the proper flu season of the January, February. We have a staffing crisis. 100,000 jobs in the NHS are still unfilled. 100,000. And you can see that is, of course, a big problem. We have ongoing strikes in some areas. We have a chemist crisis, which is coming to your area if it hasn't already. We have a dental access crisis. And of course, we have the crumbling concrete crisis, which is a bit of a tongue twister, but it is present in the NHS buildings just as much as it is in schools. Put all that together, the waiting list in England alone is 7.75 million people from a low of 2.32 million. We have got a problem. That is just in England. It's about 1 in 8 of the entire English population. Many of those are employed people. We can't directly compare Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland because each of them have slightly different ways of recording their waiting lists. But it would be reasonable, very reasonable, to assume that the waiting list for the UK as a whole is somewhere between 8.5 and 9.5 million people awaiting treatment. And if they're an employed individual or indeed a self-employed individual, it is almost certainly affecting their work. See that quote there from the ONS. So we have some real genuine challenges around the wellbeing triangle. We can't rely on the NHS, and we do need to support the financial aspects for our employees as best we can. So let's start with those pay reviews for 2024, because many of you will be in the midst of that process now. How do we actually give a meaningful pay review, given that we have to balance profit versus pay? And I'm not really going to go into that bit on these slides, which I apologize, just because it is very unique to each different employer. But not only is there a cost of living and a cost of borrowing crisis, there's also a cost of doing business crisis for employers, and I'm very aware of that. What I'm trying to give you here are just the economic factors that you should be factoring in to your pay review process. And I've broken it down in the old red, amber, green, and we're starting in reverse order with the good news. Well, the good news, one of the things that's been driving inflation and therefore in turn driving pay reviews as well, is that candidate crisis. And we are starting to see that ease, but as I said earlier, not by much. So it's good news that we don't have to worry so much about that. But for many sectors, they are still understaffed. They are still seeking staff and talent. So it hasn't eased by very much. In the amber, well, again, a little bit of good news. The domestic energy prices, gas, electricity that we were seeing last year, they've stabilized. So that is good. They're not going up anymore. That said, they're still twice where they were in 2021. So we're paying a lot more, but at least they're not going up too much at the moment. In terms of fuel, I'm talking about petrol there and diesel. That has been going up a lot in the last 2 or 3 months, about 9 or 10% since July. It's stabilized again at the moment. In fact, it's dropped a couple of pence in some areas over the last couple of weeks. But we don't know what's going to happen with that crisis in the Middle East and what that's going to mean for oil prices in the medium term. National living wage, we already know from Jeremy Hunt's conference speech that that's going up by at least 5.6% from next April. And it may well and probably will be higher than that. I've written a post on that, and if you want that, I can send you that full details after the event. So that's obviously driving some people. You can't avoid that if you're paying national living wage. But above that, we have pay differentials. How your pay is structured to keep different bands earning different levels and a decent interval between the two. Well, that has a knock-on effect up the scales. So in terms of pay review, you might want to start at 5.6% because that's the minimum that you're going to have to give people at the bottom. And then we have the red, which are still the two I just flagged earlier. Interest rates and inflation, they're still high, they're staying high, and we need to accept this is really contracting a lot of employees' salaries now. And we need to get the pay review right, even allow for the fact that we have limited spending power, because employee engagement, which is key to productivity, is not something the UK has been very good at. This is a chart produced by Gallup. They do it each year. And you'll see that the UK is 33rd out of 38 countries in terms of how engaged our workforce is, either with their job or with their employer, or ideally both. And that is really, really poor. You could be one of those people that says, well, why are we comparing this against Europe, Steve? We're not in Europe anymore. Well, geographically, we are. Let's get that one out of the way. And secondly, if you wanted me to compare the UK against the old English-speaking world, if you like, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, well, I could do that, and it looks even worse. We're right at the bottom of that pile. So we need to improve engagement. And if we get the pay review wrong, if people don't feel valued, then that's not going to help. And the problem with engagement is it has all sorts of knock-on impacts. Low engagement can and often does lead to increased absence. People at work less. If they're at work, they're not going to be as productive. It can and often does lead to lower productivity. You know, an engaged employee will probably leave at 10 past 5 rather than 10 to 5. That makes a difference. And it can and often does lead to more mistakes. And you've only got to cast your mind back to the summer months and think of a couple of really big breaches and mistakes that happened through human error. So we had the police services in Northern Ireland and Suffolk with huge data breaches, just human error. We had air traffic control completely buggered over the bank holiday weekend, the time they really couldn't afford to be, because somebody uploaded a flight plan that was wrong. And that shows you how important it is to keep people on board and engaged and productive. And data breaches, which are probably the biggest thing that threatens everyone on this call today, whether you know it or not, are often caused by human error. And if you haven't got cyber insurances in place, let me know and we can put you in contact with someone who's good on that area. So that's hopefully positioned where we are for right now. My final thoughts: the economy is clearly fragile, and as employers, we need to do what we can to boost our own personal productivity as a company, and by extension, the national economy. Well-being is a challenge. Financial well-being has never been more acute than it is right now. And then we have physical and mental, the lack of support from the NHS. We need to find ways of bypassing that with policies in whatever format. UK engagement is low, and that leads to poor productivity issues. And pay and benefits can help with all of the above, but you need to take a step back and work out what you're trying to achieve and how you can best support that well-being triangle, all three sides equally. And I'm very happy to have a conversation with you after this event. That's me. If you haven't connected with me on LinkedIn, please do. For what it's worth, I'm a top human resources voice, apparently. Not quite sure what that means, but it's nice to have the badge, if nothing else. And there's my details, and there's plenty of articles that I've written that I can share with you to support what I've just zipped through in 20 minutes flat. Many thanks for listening, and I'll pass over to Sophie.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Steve. That's really interesting. And I hope that I'm not going to bring you all down for the next 10 minutes where we're talking about markets and how that impacts us and people in general. Steve is going to be my Debbie McGee and be next slide, please. So I'm going to take you back to the COVID pandemic with the next slide, please. So what I wanted to start with is showing you an overview of what happens when we have big world events, how it affects the markets, and also what this means to us personally and our investments. So I'm going to take you back in time. This is the S&P 500 over the last 100 years. So the S&P 500 is the top 500 companies in the US. And you can see here, it's got how it's performed over the 100 years. And it's got those big events on there and what the impact on markets has been from these. So coming back to sort of more recent times, you can see there's a huge dip in 2008. That was the global financial crisis. A very interesting dip in 2020, which was from COVID. And then more recently in 2022, when Russia invaded the Ukraine. But what does this show us? It shows us the impact of these events on the markets. It helps us to better understand how markets react to these events. So we're talking about the US market, but it's a reflection of all markets really from equities point of view, so stocks and shares. It helps to give us the tools as well to build how the markets might now be impacted by future events. So post 2022, what's happened next? So what I've got here for you all is making sense of world events. So headlines from the last year across all different types of papers, all different sentiments there. Now, we have to bear in mind, headlines are designed to be provocative. They're designed to make people read and buy the paper. But I do think they are a reflection of what Steve was saying. People are feeling uncertainty, what's been going on in the world, and sort of what that really can mean to individuals, businesses, and for our investments. What this is essentially showing is, as Steve said, the two big things that are going to be themes throughout this presentation, which is inflation has increased, and to combat this, interest rates have also increased. Next slide, please, Steve. Thank you. So what happened here? So what I've done here is given you an example of inflation and what it's done over the last 10 years. So it's sort of trying to bring that headline into context. So inflation, as we've talked about already today, is the additional amount that something cost this year compared to previous years. It's not, going into negative territory. We can see a little bit of that from certain elements back in the early sort of 2014. What it's showing you is it's been fairly stagnant for the last 10 years up until 2022. Now, these two lines, the CPIH, you might not have heard of, but it is the most comprehensive measure of inflation. It's essentially that basket of goods, but it also includes a housing element. Then you can also see there's the food and non-alcoholic beverages. Essentially, it's my way of trying to show you what's happened more recently to the cost of buying essentials. So foods, we can't get away from buying food. As Steve was saying, you know, that's what the big impact has been. And the cost of food increasing has been a big contributory factor into inflation increasing. This is what this cost of living crisis, headline grabbing sort of way of saying the cost of inflation is high. This also puts that additional pressure on people because, as Steve said, people are impacted because they have to pay more for their essentials. And what I'm trying to sort of put into context here is that has gone up hugely over the last year. I think we're all aware of that, but it's just to sort of put it in numbers term, because I'm not saying we've been complacent, but we haven't seen this for quite a long time. Next slide, please, Steve. So this is some numbers. So in real terms, the cost of certain things we can't really avoid buying, whether it's directly or indirectly, and what that's actually meant. Now, as Steve said in his presentation, the UK has struggled more than other countries with this surging cost of food. And that's mainly because of a shortage of workers post-pandemic and with Brexit and all the sort of issues that go with that. But also we have a heavy reliance on natural gas, which we use to generate a lot of our power, and domestic heating. And those are the biggest factors that have caused inflation to sort of go up. Now, to combat this, because let's be honest, none of us really want to be paying nearly 15% extra for our tea and other elements year on year. The Bank of England, who sets on sort of monetary policy, have increased the interest rates. They go hand in hand. So essentially what we're trying to do by increasing interest rates, or what they're planning to do, is that it puts pressure on you to borrow less money or pay off debt, and encourages you to save, because you're going to get a higher rate of cash in the bank on that money, that interest rate, if interest rates are higher. Now, the impact is you'll spend less. So you're not going to be buying as many things as you would do otherwise, because you haven't got that ability to. You're probably not going to borrow money to do it either. Now, if you and everyone else spends less on these goods and services, effectively, there's not as much market for them, and therefore the prices rise more slowly. And that helps to reduce the rate of inflation and hopefully bring that rate down, which is what we have been seeing more recently. And especially in that chart that I showed you, you know, September 23, things have started to reduce down. Now, as Steve said, that doesn't mean the cost of things is getting less. It means the increase in how much they're costing you is reducing. And that has a big impact on all of us and sort of what we're seeing. And next slide, please, Steve. So I'm going to bring you sort of round to this timeline. So how did we get here? Why has inflation increased, and what this really means for us? Now, Steve's already talked you through sort of a bit of this timeline already, but I think this just sort of helps to give you an idea of how many events we have faced as a country, as a global economy as well, over the last sort of 18 months, you know, nearly 2 years now, and what that really means. So I've started this off with 2022, a bit like Steve did, because that is where Russia invaded the Ukraine at the start of the year, and that's where we started to see that rise in inflation. There were supply issues, there's various elements which especially impacted us in the UK. But what does this mean for markets? Now, we also had a lot of market uncertainty in the UK, but also globally, because what happened was, to combat this inflationary pressure everyone is feeling, the UK, US, and other governments as well, but these are the two we're going to focus on, they increased their interest rates. Now, that then had an impact on growth. So as Steve talked you through with the GDP, there's a threat of recession. And that's where we have 2 negative growth quarters, which again, doesn't really make sense, but essentially it's 2 contracting quarters back to back. Now, as you saw from his slides, that hasn't happened yet, but it's that threat of it and that causing uncertainty, and people don't feel as secure. You're not going to go out and buy the most expensive house you possibly can if you're worried about your jobs. Now, your employees and you as businesses are aware of the threats that this causes and that uncertainty, and it naturally makes you more cautious. What we've also seen in the UK is a hideous time of it with legislation. We've had 3 prime ministers in a year. I mean, just absolutely ridiculous, really. We have no political certainty. Now, that doesn't impact the market so much, but that does impact us as individuals and the legislation that dictates how much tax we pay, how much we can save into things such as pensions. Now, what you can also see here is some global events like US midterm elections and the reversal of, uncertainty in the US. Is it uncertain? Then there's a bit more stability, and it's going backwards and forwards, much like that chart that Steve showed you earlier in the slideshow. Now, that uncertainty, what does it mean for markets? So inflation impacts markets because when interest rates rise, the bond markets fall. Now, the bond markets tend to be the lower risk end of investments generally, because essentially what you're doing is lending money to governments or big corporates and getting paid a rate of interest for lending it to them. Now, the value of those investments when interest rates rise comes down because people take risk to buy them. And then when you're, getting 5% in the bank, you're not going to take the risk that a corporate or a government or something might go wrong. So automatically the value of those investments falls, which is why we saw a big drop last year in those lower risk investments. Now, inflation also impacts equity markets because companies can't borrow as much as they could, so there might be cash flow issues. The gearing and the debt that they have naturally is costing them more, but also we get market speculation. It's rampant at the moment, and that's never good for share prices and economies. And it's not good for us as individuals because the value of things such as our pensions, we're seeing losses year on year. And especially if you're getting closer to retirement, that can be a little bit worrying. There's also a bit of uncertainty around what's going to happen with our economy. As Steve said, that impacts all of us, whether it be from a business point of view, from a personal point of view, or from our investments. But what I want to finish on is some positives. So we've got some fantastic rates for annuities coming back. So I personally haven't done many annuities since 2012. And the reason for that is the rates were really low. And effectively now what you can do is exchange your pension fund in return for a guaranteed income for life at a much higher rate. So what I'm seeing with clients is people who are looking at retiring are worried because their pension's fallen, but actually the income that they can guarantee themselves is pretty much on a par. It's also a good time to start saving because if you're investing in markets that are a little bit uncertain on a monthly basis, you're spreading the risk of that investment and hopefully buying into funds while they're fairly low, which hopefully means you'll have more growth in the future once we get back to that certainty. Now, over the next year, we're not likely to see a huge amount of certainty because we are likely to still see some of that sort of unknown because we're not sure what the market reaction to all these changes we're going to see over the next year is. But I think it's important that we put it all into context, and taking you back to that first slide where we've seen some absolutely cataclysmic events and what that really means for us as individuals and also the markets. So we've seen some dramatic events, a big storm of 87. It did feel like that here in Oxford last night, but luckily it didn't happen. But, the financial crisis in 2008, things do recover in the end. And it's about keeping cautious, but still being optimistic for the future. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview of markets and what impact that has for us as individuals and also for businesses and the wider picture. What I would say is there is a chat box on the Zoom. So if you've got any questions, we've had a number submitted beforehand. Do feel free to ask them. Sadly, I can't tell you which is the best investments to have over the next few years, because if I could predict the future like that, I probably wouldn't be sat here. But do ask if you've got any questions about this. And I'm going to pass you over to Craig.
Great. Thank you, Sophie. Brilliant. That was really useful. So thanks for that. So yeah, my part of the presentation really is to bring it back to kind of pensions. Those of you that know me know I'm pretty passionate about pensions and love talking all things pensions. So we're just going to, over the next kind of 10 minutes or so, cover off some kind of themes and areas that I think are going to be relevant in the next 12, 18 months. So Steve, if you can move us on, please. So the kind of factors that are going to influence your company workplace pension scheme and in turn your employees' pension provision are a number of factors really. And some of these have already been kind of covered off this morning, but clearly we've got the kind of general election coming up on the horizon. And, you know, I get really kind of quite frustrated that kind of pensions are often used as kind of political footballs. You know, they kind of get kicked around a little bit and changed, which makes it really difficult for individuals to plan. In terms of what we see potentially coming in the next general election, you know, that's a bit of an unknown, but, you know, we've already had the government make changes to, say, the pension lifetime allowance from April of this year. And at that point, Labour were really vocal in saying they didn't think that was right, and they would reverse that if they came into power. So, you know, quite a big fundamental change of pension legislation could be quite a short-lived one if Labour have their way or stand true to their initial reaction to that change. Salary exchange, something we'll talk about a couple of times in this presentation. You know, that's an area which has often been mooted as something which could be closed from a pension perspective. It's been clamped down from wider employee benefit provision. You know, that might be something the government look to close for new schemes. So new schemes that aren't up and running. I don't think they can change it for existing, but, you know, that's something they could look at. And then there's always the continued threat about the equalisation of pension tax relief, because we know that kind of you get tax relief at 20, 40, 45%, depending on your tax status. And I think all governments would love to have a kind of flat rate of savings where it comes down for higher earners, but goes up for the average kind of earner within the UK. So maybe a flat tax relief rate of something like 25, 30%. And that's always been mooted around. So we'll have to see if anything like that comes out in the future. The increase in national living wage, Steve's already mentioned the implications of that for you as an employer perspective. Clearly, you know, a significant increase on the back of the increase we had at the start of April. The implications that has for those of you that have a company pension scheme using salary sacrifice or salary exchanges, you may just need to revisit the entry level. Those of you that have worked with myself will know that we set a kind of a ceiling, an earnings point in which employees have to earn above, so they're not at risk of going below minimum wage when allowing for a pension deduction. So with that rate rising, you may need to revisit that kind of entry level. So generally, I would suggest we look at somewhere around about 10% above the national living wage rate. So, you know, obviously quite an increase on £11 plus per hour if that's where we're heading. Auto enrolment changes. So the government are really keen to make changes to automatic enrolment, primarily designed to help younger people and lower earners, and often females who tend to make up quite a large proportion of the part-time workforce. So the changes that are coming along, no dates for this as yet, but I'm hearing this could come into play around 2025, but to be confirmed. Firstly is that bringing forward the earliest age that somebody's enrolled from 22 to 18. Now, I think that's a great move. I think it makes sense. But it does mean if you are in a sector or a company where you do bring in lots of younger individuals, it will mean that as a company, you will have to start paying into their pension at a younger age. I think it's great for the individual because we all know the payments you make when you're young are the most powerful because of compound investment returns. But I think the main one which would impact some companies, and I know there are some people on this call that have pension schemes set up with what's called qualifying earnings. And that's whereby the first £6,200 of somebody's income is not pensionable. Now, the government don't like that. It penalises low earners. Quite simply, if I earn £12,000 a year, auto enrolment contributions of 8% are not based on 12,000. They're based on roughly £6,000. So that has a huge impact on what I get out of my pension at retirement. So the government want to remove that lower earnings limit, make £1 of income pensionable. And that in principle sounds great, but obviously it does mean that represents an increased cost to employers and employees alike. So from an employer perspective, that would represent, with a 3% contribution, an extra £187 per annum per employee. Now you multiply that by the number of employees potentially in your pension scheme, your workforce, that does represent a pretty significant cost. And I think for that reason, the government would have to phase that introduction over a period of time. Okay. As I say, these changes are really born around trying to get lower earners, boost their retirement income. And I think the key word for retirement saving and pensions in the coming years will be outcomes. What are the outcomes for employees? Undoubtedly seeing greater demand now for kind of responsible investing. I think that's twofold. I think we all know there's greater appetite and desire to do right by the planet and invest in ethical investments. That's aligned twofold, really, I guess, to corporate views. So organizations want to make sure that their pension scheme, their benefits are aligned to their corporate views and values. So we're seeing kind of companies looking at that from an employer perspective, but also we're seeing employees as well saying, well, do you know what? I've got a pension fund. I want to make sure it's doing right by the environment, etc. So I want to go into ethical investment funds. And all of the providers are incorporating this into their default funds. But more and more providers now are offering specific kind of ESG, kind of environmental, social, and governance funds that 100% meet that criteria. So it's about having choice for individuals, I suggest. And then the final factor is what Steve has obviously kind of painted a pretty challenging picture, Sophie as well, in terms of what's happening in recent years and how that may kind of continue into next year. Really, is we've got economic and global factors which impact markets. Unfortunately, we are at a time where people are seeing their pension values go down. It's much more easy to see now when people have access via their phone, their apps, or what have you. But it does sometimes cause alarm bells for individuals, and ultimately it could impact people that it does delay their retirement plans. They may have to retire a little bit later. So there's lots going on, as always, in pensions, and I think some of these factors are obviously outside of our control. Others, maybe something we can help drive and deliver at employer level. So next slide, please, Steve. So the next area is around kind of from your perspective is kind of the people challenges, really. And this isn't necessarily specific to pensions, but more so the cost of living, the borrowing crisis. All these things, as Steve has explained, are putting real strain on our finances. I know when my fixed rate mortgage ended at the end of last year, typically the rate jumped quite dramatically. And, I know that's impacting lots of individuals as well. And as an employer, this is where you can try to help with that to a point. Obviously, we can't keep giving pay rises because that's not sustainable. That kind of balancing against kind of pay versus profit that Steve mentioned is a really valid one. But also, I think when you keep giving pay rises, it becomes expected, it loses its value. So it's looking at other ways to do this. And, I never believe that someone's going to stay with a company just because of their pension. But when you incorporate a good pension scheme and build that into a wider range of quality employee benefits, we do know more and more people now are looking at the overall remuneration, the overall package they receive. So the pension can be a really useful tool in helping with that. Kind of employee health, Steve's already kind of covered that off. I think that's obviously a key area, but these financial anxieties, the financial pressures can kind of have a massive impact on productivity, which ultimately affects your bottom line. So this is where, the benefits, the pensions can help hopefully get people engaged, get them more productive, and help bring success to your business. Okay, Steve, next one, please. So for me, the key with pensions now, I want to change the dial a little bit, I think, with pensions is that, the automatic enrollment has been a great success. The government have got more and more of us saving into our pensions. Back in 2012, there was around about £33 billion saved in workplace pension schemes. 2021, that figure was about £114 billion. So clearly lots more money is going into pensions. But I think too many people are a bit blind in terms of what it's going to give them. And my worry is that people are going to think, well, if I'm paying 8% of my salary, as told by the government, and it may not be their salary because it's on qualifying earnings presently, but I'm paying 8%, that's going to give me the income I need in retirement. And I think most of us on this meeting will know that's not really the case. So whilst auto enrollment has been a success in getting us in a pension, undoubtedly it's made us less engaged. It's all done for us. The days of filling an application form and thinking about what we're going to pay, where we're going to invest, have gone. Our employers just put us in on day one after 3 months. We don't make an active decision. We just see it on a pay slip and we get some documentation in the post, which, dare I say it, some of your employees will probably barely glance at. So they're not engaged with the detail of their pension scheme. So they're kind of ticking along, leading along a little bit blind, really, and completely unaware of whether they're on track, what it's going to give them, etc. So for me, this is where we're big advocates of employees using technology, using the online tools, the apps, etc. of this world to look at their pension, try to get a better understanding of what it's going to give them. So that at least if they know they're not on track, they're aware of it, they can plan accordingly. Because the cost of living crisis is not just going to impact now, but it's going to impact going forward with rises, increases. As Steve says, it doesn't mean prices are going to come back down. So what might have been enough for someone to save at retirement, the level of income they felt they needed at retirement, may no longer be the case. Conversely, people are changing their retirement plans, maybe because of the investment markets, because of the cost of living crisis, but people are having to put back their time they're going to retire or phase their retirement to reflect the strain on their finances. And that obviously has an impact on you in the workplace, that you have people remaining in the business that may want to carry on working and be totally engaged, but equally you may have people that's kind of mentally had kind of resigned themselves to retiring at a point and are now staying because they have to, and are kind of going through the motions a little bit, which obviously makes it a little bit tricky, really. But the key is retirement's expensive, and we need people to help understand what that means. So Steve, on the next slide, I just wanted to show you some information here. So this is some research that the Pensions and Lifetime Saving Association produce each year. I think it's magic. I think it really provides some good information, because for too many of us, we don't really know what retirement looks like in years to come. And it might be 10, 20, 30 years. It's really hard to visualize, what do I need in retirement? Okay. I don't know am I going to be on the golf course all the time? Am I going to be going on holidays? What's my health going to be? We really don't know. So this report issued kind of each year kind of just gives people a broad indication of the level of income they need to sustain a certain level of standard of living. So they basically categorize in three areas: a minimum standard of living, a moderate, and a comfortable. Now, the difference between the three varies. They make assumptions around your weekly shop, how often you holiday, your gifts to family for birthday presents, etc. But to put it a bit of context, kind of the minimum living retirement standard assumes a kind of shop per week on groceries of about £54. I know we spend a lot more than that in our house, and a kind of UK holiday each year. Whereas when we go to the more comfortable kind of lifestyle, we're looking at about £145 a week shopping, and 3 weeks a year kind of on a European holiday. So you can see the kind of difference, and obviously the impact that has on income requirements. What this table is trying to show is that, for someone who wants a moderate level of income living outside of the UK, for a single person, they need around £23,000 a year as an income. If you look at that jointly, it's about £34,000. Now, this slide here, which we've been put together by Standard Life, assumes that someone has a full state pension, which is about £10,600. So in this example, they need to have an income of about £12,700. Now, if they were to buy an annuity today at the age of 66, they would need a pension fund of £285,000. Now, to put that into a bit of context, the average pension fund, which surprised me at age 66, according to ONS in 2019-2020, was actually £220,000. So some people, obviously clearly a shortfall there, and I think there are a lot of people that aren't quite at that level. So as I say, it comes back to outcomes, trying to educate your employees in terms of what this is going to give them and what they need to do, and get those payments in where they can, conscious we've got the cost of living crisis. Next slide, please, Steve. So in terms of kind of key themes, and I'm kind of conscious of time, I think there are kind of three key areas here. I think compliance at the end is obviously a given. You have to make sure you're complying with automatic enrolment. The pension regulator are flexing their muscles. They're making sure that companies are doing the right thing at the right time. And if you're not, there's financial penalties. But I think more so, there's potentially reputational damage as well. You don't want the regulator kind of contacting your employees about late payments or non-payments. You don't want the reputational damage of not complying with automatic enrolment, because that won't make you the employer of choice. But I think the key here is around engagement. We are seeing more and more companies wanting to help their employees around engagement. So that's making sure we've got a pension provider that has good online tools, just the basics, and app, things like what if calculators. What do I get out of my pension if I pay more, I pay less? Obviously, we can help with kind of clinics, workshops, helplines, all those kind of things, an intermediary such as Integrity 365 can offer. The financial savings, you can still help your employees within the cost of living when it comes to pensions. Some of you will offer salary sacrifice with your staff pension schemes, others won't. You know, for those of you that don't utilize it, you are missing a trick here, because not only does this create a saving of national insurance for you as an employer, but it does reduce the cost of paying into the pension for your employees. So this is a great way of saying, guys, we're helping you build your retirement, but reduce the cost and help the cost of living. But from an employer perspective, if you're one of those companies that have got qualifying earnings in place and you're going to see your cost per employee go up by what, £187 a year, you may well find that the NI savings generated by that employee doing salary exchange will kind of nullify that increase. So it will kind of, you know, make it cost neutral from your perspective. And then the final area is value for money. You know, there's greater regulatory pressure coming down the road. The government want to make sure that pension scheme providers and employers have pension schemes that are providing value for money, i.e. giving the best outcomes for your employees. So that will come down the road naturally through providers and demonstrating that the charges are fair, the performance is fair, the service is good. So those kind of things will be looked at. But I think your role as an employer is that duty of care to be sure that you know the scheme you have in place is providing your employees with the best chance to build a pension. And, you know, that kind of due diligence to review that scheme every 3-5 years is absolutely valid. You know, we're helping lots of companies that set up a pension scheme in a bit of a hurry when automatic enrollment came along, maybe through their accountant because it was the easy option, but they've now outgrown that pension scheme and they now want to build a pension scheme that is a real benefit for their employees. So they want something more comprehensive. So that review and audit is something that can be looked at. Okay. So Steve, I think from there, if we can just move forward to questions, please, just go, we're conscious of time. So I think at this point, what we do now is, you know, obviously brilliant presentations from kind of Steve, Sophie, thanks for that. You know, great to have you on board. Obviously, we'd love to have some questions if we have any. I can see there's a little tab in the bottom here. So it looks like do we have a question? Okay, so we've got a question from Katie, who's joined. I'll be looking to move my pension for Scotland Widows. Is this going to cause me a loss? Yeah, so I think the reality here is, you know, the transfer value of your pension fund will be based on the value of that pension at the point of transfer. So if your fund has gone down at the current point because of the economic position and the underlying investment funds, then clearly the fund value that's going to be transferred could be less than what you've paid in. So there won't be a penalty per such, a penalty charge, but there will be the investment loss, which you will then crystallize upon that transfer. Clearly, the flip side of that will be is when you transfer that fund, it's a bit like Sophie said earlier on, when you're paying into a pension, whether that's a transfer value or a regular monthly payment, when the markets are lower, you are buying more units for your money because the unit price, the share price effectively is that little bit lower. But what will ultimately determine which will provide the higher outcome at retirement, the higher income at retirement, will be the difference in charges between the respective pension funds and ultimately the investment returns of those providers between now and when you retire ultimately. So it's not always a straightforward answer, a position. And if you want to kind of pick that out with me individually, we can obviously have a look at that in a bit more depth. Okay. So thanks for that, Katie. If anyone's got any other questions, kind of feel free to kind of pop them in the chat and let's get some of the guys talking again. Shall we? Steve's had a little break. He's had a cup of tea. So so we did have a couple of questions kind of in advance. We asked a couple of clients just to ask some questions if they had any. And I think, Steve, one for you, Steve, is kind of from a benefit perspective, kind of what benefits do you find are more appealing to maybe younger workforce? You know, obviously bringing younger workers into the company. What should companies be looking for?
Well, of course, without wishing to do you down, pensions, if you're 18 or 20 or 25 or even 30, they're never going to happen to you. It's not a real thing. It is, of course, and it's really important that we get that message across. So pensions lack a bit of wow factor to the younger audience, but actually, exactly as Craig said earlier, the more money you can get at a young age, the better your situation. So get the pension message across anyway. And then look for things that are actually going to support them. I mean, typically, and it's a broad brush for which I apologise, but typically younger employees are earning less by definition. They're at the start of their career. So anything that supports them financially. So it could be things as simple as a discount scheme just to help them spend less money on their weekly shopping will make a difference to them. And they're going to see that in a tangible way. So it's about thinking about not just, I mean, you've got to support all of your employees and all of their health and well-being issues. But for the younger audience, you want things they can actually see a tangible return on because they're less likely to use their healthcare policies because they're young. They're less likely to see a pension because they're young. So give them things that may not cost a lot, but they will probably appreciate disproportionately.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Are you okay to stop sharing the presentation, please, Steve? Is that all right?
Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah.
If I can work it
I had
out.
a question from Jamie on the call. So Jamie, I know we're engaged from a pension perspective, so I'll come back to you kind of outside of this call on that question, if that's okay. I'm conscious of time. It is 11 o'clock. We kind of allowed an hour, so if anyone needs to leave, please, obviously you can. The idea is that we will the presentation is recorded, so we'll circulate it afterwards. But I know there was one question for you, Sophie, if that's okay. I talked about kind of sustainability, and just be good to get your view on how kind of ESG sustainable funds tend to generally perform in comparison to kind of non-sustainable equity funds, if you could.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic, and as you said, it's become a real sort of conversation between generations. I'm lucky enough that I look after a lot of families as well as businesses, and I found that the younger generation are having more of an impact on the sort of overall family view, and it's become more of a conversation with clients that traditionally I probably wouldn't have talked to about this sort of thing. I think as well, sort of a lot of businesses have taken the stance that they want to be as sort of ESG friendly as possible. I've got a number of clients who are trying to go for B Corp status and that sort of thing. So that's where we're trying to do sort of our best for everyone and the environment around us. Fundamentally, when you restrict yourself in the market, there is going to be a higher level of risk. So if you're looking at things from an ESG perspective, you're going to reduce the amount of diversification you can have. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes they can perform quite well. Sometimes, it does lead to sort of a more volatile investment sometimes. But what I'd say is you have to look at what your motivation is. Is it to make as much money as possible and have the highest returns? Or is it to have a more sustainable, longer term investment? Now, over the last year, we have seen some of their sort of more ESG friendly investments doing fairly well. Energy prices increasing has been good for renewable energy, but more recently that has become something that has come down and it is likely to maybe sort of underperform a traditional portfolio in some ways. But again, it's all about what that motivation is.
Right, yeah, and it is a tough subject, right? I know, we kind of come across this a lot in the corporate workspace, and it's always difficult with investments because we always kind of live a little bit for the moment, not take that long-term view. So yeah, thanks very much for that. So look, listen, I'm conscious of time. We've overrun the hour, so I think what I would say is if anybody's got any further questions, any feedback, any thoughts they want to share, then kind of please come back to us, come back to myself. Obviously, kind of the Integrity Marketing team. You've got the email address from the invitation. Feel free to drop us a note, and all three of us would be happy to help further. Big thanks to Steve, Sophie for joining today, but most importantly, thank you to you guys for joining. I say the first time we've done this as a joint kind of event with Steve and Partners, and thrilled with the take-up rate. A lot of people have dialed in, and hopefully you've all taken something from it. So yeah, thanks for joining. Watch out for the kind of circulation of the presentation if you want to listen to it again sometime. And yeah, thanks very much for your time. Thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you.